Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Crop Planning 101 webinar. My name is Gittleman. I am the Workshops and Education Coordinator for NYC Parks GreenThumb. We are the community garden office of the New York City Parks Department. We really appreciate everyone tuning in. GreenThumb is so grateful for everything you are all doing to keep our gardens safe and healthy. We hope you and your loved ones are safe as well. Throughout the webinar, it's important that folks please stay muted so that we don't have any audio interference with our presentations today. But throughout the course of the webinar, if you have any questions, my colleagues Elena and Babby will be monitoring the chat and pulling your questions into our Q&A documents for later. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We will hold on to them until it's time for Q&A. We are recording this session, and you can choose whether or not your camera is on by clicking the little camcorder icon, but we're going to keep the recording focused on Ciara and myself as the facilitators. So thank you all so much for joining us. I am going to share my screen and get going. Oh, before we begin, we want to do, actually, Ciara, will you introduce yourself and then we'll begin?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your day to be here. My name is Ciara Sidell, and I am the Urban Farm Manager at the Randall's Island Park Alliance. I run an educational farm at the park, and the Alliance itself maintains, sustains all the programming and operations of Randall's Island in New York City. That's good?
That's great.
Sweet.
So excited you're joining us today, Ciara.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. We are loading. In the meantime, we'd love to know a little bit more about who is here. And so I've launched a little poll. You can select all that apply. We're curious to know what your experience is growing food and whether you've made or used a crop plan before. Very cool. So we have a lot of backyard gardeners joining us. That's amazing. Welcome. A lot of community gardeners with individual plots and community gardeners and farmers with production scale beds. A few urban farmers, rural farmers, school gardeners, and a whole bunch of beginners. Welcome. With crop plans, we have a bunch of folks who have not made a crop plan before. Great, welcome. And some who have worked with someone else's crop plan or made a crop plan on yourself. So throughout the webinar, if you have things to add, especially if you're from a different like growing zone than New York City, feel free to add in the chat. Be really helpful to share insight throughout the course of this webinar. All right, let's try this again. All right. It might just leave us not in present mode. Does this look, Ciara, can you let me know if this looks okay font size wise?
Yeah, I'm able to make that portion bigger on my screen. So if others are also, you can like drag the videos to make the shared screen bigger. So just a suggestion for anyone who might see it further away.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So we're going to begin with site analysis. So you want to think, before you even begin thinking about what you want to grow, you need to know where you're growing. For me right now, I'm not part of a garden or farm, but I used to be. For me right now, I'm just growing on my balcony. It gets light in the morning because I'm east facing. In the summer, it gets a lot of sun from the south, but in the winter, it does not. So where are you growing? Do you have sunny areas? Do you have shady areas? What's the soil drainage situation like? Are there some parts of the land that drain really well? Are there some parts that puddle every time it rains? Is there a slope? What is your access to water? Do you have to hook up a fire hydrant every time? And then what are you growing? Is this a vegetable garden? Is this a flower or ornamental garden? Is there shade for sitting under that you want to cultivate? Is that what you want, like summertime shade garden? And then what conditions do the above require? So we are going to take a few minutes in breakout rooms so that you can introduce yourselves to one another and share a little bit about the site that you're working with. So when you get into your pairs, you can share what kind of environment you have to work with, consider the sun, water, soil. Are there any existing structures like walls or trees or rocks that are interesting or that you can grow on or that are in your way? What are the advantages of your site? What are the disadvantages of your site? So just a little bit about like where you're growing, what your intentions are with that space, and yeah, and a little bit about the pros and cons, what you're excited about with your space and what you're nervous about with your space. So this will be quick. You can also introduce yourself, but we'll have the breakout rooms open for just 5 minutes. And you can return to the main session at any time. So again, if you're just tuning in, welcome. We're about to go into breakout rooms to talk about your site. I will put the prompt in the chat as well once you get into the breakout room in case you can't see my screen anymore. Welcome back, everyone. So crop planning really starts with your site first and foremost, that you have an understanding of what your options are. I think folks are still coming back from their breakout rooms. If you'd like to put in the chat a little bit about what you all discussed in terms of the site, good site that you have to work with, please do so. I'm seeing someone has some sun, but a tree in a gazebo, a backyard garden that has both sun and shade. This is great. Okay. So we're going to move on to, okay, so what are we talking about when we're talking about crop planning? This is such a fun thing to do in winter as a grower. This is when you get to really dream and think about your site. Oh, there was a question in the chat. Will these slides be available after? Yes, I can send out the slides after, and we are also recording, and we'll send out the link to the recording afterwards as well. So if you are just tuning in, you can catch up on the beginning part. So all of the GreenThumb webinars are available on the GreenThumb website as well. Okay, so crop planning, what are your goals? Are you trying to grow year round, or are you just trying to grow something in the summer? Is this ornamental, or is this a food garden, or both? And then who are you growing for? What do they like to eat? If you don't like to eat radishes, don't plant radishes. If you really like to eat string beans, go for it. What crops will meet these needs? So we have cool weather crops and warm weather crops, and we're going to talk about the difference. Planting times, harvest times, all of that information, the specifics of planting times and harvest times are available in the crop planning section of the GreenThumb Growing Food Toolkit. I will say with the caveat, I just put a link in the chat that, you know, most of our programming is geared towards folks in the New York City area. So if you are tuning in from a different growing region, then please check with your state's land grant institute. Usually it's a university that has an agricultural program, and they will have a lot of these same tools, but for your region. Okay, so are these crops that you want to grow annual? Do you have to plant them every year? Will they come back? Are they perennial? Are they basically in the same spot every year? Are they going from seed or transplant? So some crops that you're growing a lot of, like carrots, you'll want to sow directly in the ground, but some crops where you have, one every 2 or 3 feet, like tomatoes or squash, those can be grown by transplant. Will you be going to transplants? If so, how and where? If not, where will you get them? How much space do you have? How much space does each crop require? What else? So in the GreenThumb Growing Food Toolkit, there are a lot of different tools that you can use to plan out your garden. We have some guides from our partners at Cornell Cooperative Extension and Bronx Greenup of the New York Botanical Garden, as well as some tools from GreenThumb, including a chart on plant families. And this is where I really like to begin with crop planning is looking at plant families, because it tells us so much information about what we're trying to grow. So as I'm talking about plant families, I would love for you to take a look at this chart. And there's a page 2, because there's so many different plant families. Plant families describe the different crops that are botanically related to each other. So as we're talking about this, I would love for you to put in the chat if any of these are surprising to you. Are you seeing crops that are related to each other that are surprising? Okay, let's see if I can get us into present mode. I don't think my computer wants to go into present mode. But we did have a suggestion that I try. So plant families are important to know when you're planning your growing season, because similar crops that are botanically similar to one another have very similar requirements. So they might be pulling similar nutrients from the soil. They might attract similar pests and diseases. Apologies for this. I'm gonna go back to my small screen, but you can drag, if you're on a computer, you can drag your screen to make it bigger. I can also zoom in. Okay, so we have a bunch of amazing crop families here and plants that are related to each other. So again, this is important to know because plants that are related to each other have similar needs and have similar requirements. And so we have a whole other page here where we have the cucumber family, the squash family, legumes, mint, grass. And so when you're thinking about planning, think about these families together because they have also similar like soil requirements as well. So for example, in the nightshade family, I'll zoom back out. And again, a copy of that chart that I just shared is in the GreenThumb Growing Food Toolkit, so you can download it there and continue to look at it. So the nightshade family includes tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, potatoes. All of these were domesticated by indigenous farmers in the Andean region in South America thousands of years ago, and they all have very similar planting requirements. They go outside when the soil is 60 degrees. To get a head start, you can plant tomatoes and peppers indoors up to 2 months ahead, and they are about 3 months from seed to harvest, and most varieties will keep producing until the first frost. So the thing to know about planting nightshades is that if you want to start early, you need to either buy transplants or have a facility to start them indoors, and they're going to keep producing throughout the entire fall. So if you plan to have a fall crop that in the same spot, then you're going to have to think about, you know, how many of each of these plants you want to grow so that you also have space for a fall crop. Another example is lettuce, which prefers cool weather. So for us in New York, that means it's spring or fall and not summer. They're 30 to 60 days to harvest, depending on if they're grown as a mix, like a salad baby greens mix, which you can grow in 30 days, or as heads of lettuce, which will require another 30 days or longer to come to fruition. I'm also going to introduce some vocab words. Intercropping is where you get to plant more than one plant variety together in the same space. There is a guide in the GreenThumb toolkit on companion planting, which are plants that really love to grow together. This example, we planted carrots in the early spring since it's a cool weather crop. And then as we harvested the carrots, we planted eggplant in its place. And I share this because it didn't work. This didn't work, it totally failed. And that happens sometimes. Carrots take a really long time to grow. They take like 3 months. So they continued to grow and shade out our baby eggplant plants. And there just wasn't enough space. So try things, but know that not everything works, and that's okay. So that's intercropping, where you have different types of plants planted together. So there's companion planting, which are crops that love to grow together. And often you'll see intercropping happen with flowers and crops. There are a lot of flowers that people plant to deter pests or attract pollinators and attract predator bugs, such as marigolds or nasturtium. There's also succession planting, which is how we describe when we plant one thing after another. So there are many examples of this. One is if you plant something like lettuce in the spring, and when you harvest the lettuce, you plant your tomatoes. And when you take your tomatoes out, you put in your cover crop. Another example is when you want a continuous harvest. So if we know we want carrots all season, we might plant carrots, and then 2 weeks later, we'll plant more carrots, and then 2 weeks later, we'll plant more carrots. We also have radishes, summer squash, beets. You'll notice that these examples that have different crops are in different plant families. So radishes are not related to summer squash, are not related to beets. And that's if you're growing, especially if you're growing in a raised bed that has like an 8x4 raised bed, which are really common in community gardens in New York City, where you have, 2 or 3 tomato plants, a row of radishes, 1 pepper plant, and some herbs. You don't need to think about this too much because you already have such a diversified planting in your soil. But if you're growing in beds that are all one crop, you want to rotate your plant families so that you avoid taxing the soil too much with certain nutrients and avoid keeping certain pests and diseases, like overwintering them in the soil. So another example might be a bed of kale and collards, which are related. You can plant them together, and then a cover crop, bok choy, callaloo, mesclun lettuce mix. So these are all different examples of ways to plan out a succession in your bed. So we have intercropping, we have succession planting. And so now I think I'm going to turn it over to Ciara, if you're ready, to show us what crop planning looks like in real time. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Sure. Okay, so that was a lot of information, nice and quick, but really awesome. I always think of crop planning a bit like a puzzle. So winter time is just puzzle season. You pull out the jigsaw puzzle, and then you also pull out all of the resources you need for a crop plan. So I want to show you, if I figure out how to share my screen, there it is. One moment. I will show you some of how we crop plan and some of the resources I use where I work at the urban farm. So let's see. Okay, you should all see on your screen the Old Farmer's Almanac. Is that accurate? Everyone's seeing this screen? Wonderful. Let me know at any point if something goes wrong. I don't typically do this. But right, I said earlier, I'm the farm manager for the Randall's Island Urban Farm, and just to paint a picture of what I'm planning or where I'm planning for, we are an educational farm that has about 100 raised beds. So it's almost this in between a community garden style space and then a more production focused space. But we don't produce our food for market. And so in a lot of ways, it's a playground of opportunity to plant what we want, where we want it, so that we can share that with as many people as possible. And I'll agree with Mara, everything that I start with are some of those resources that she already shared, thinking in categories about the planting guides, the families of crops, the types, the parts of the plant, all of that. And then I also just wanted to share that this is a website I'll go to often to remind myself of specifics for my zip code. And I already pulled up, I live in Astoria, Queens. That's close enough to Randall Island that I just used that zip code. And it shows when you should start your seeds indoors, when you can plant those seedlings or transplants outside, and then also starting them directly outside. It's very similar to some of the resources you're going to find on the GreenThumb website. But I often find that you print out a bunch of these or you pull them up on your screen, and it's sometimes nice to just compare and contrast and make sure that you kind of understand everything. It's a lot of information to pull together. And so it's great to have all, oh, this is just another example of a document that I put together, and you could see here based on the colors that I was identifying. Oh, now it's scrolling, my computer's a little slow. I was sorting not necessarily by categories of plant family, but by the types of plants. And that was just another way to think about what I want to put in the beds. A few categories that I find beneficial are thinking about companion crops, which we touched upon, and then also pests and diseases. So if certain crops experience the same or struggle with the same pests or diseases, I'm not going to want to put something of that family or something that is affected the next year by the same pest. So that's just something to consider. But I want to show you more. I'm trying to figure out how to move this. Oh boy. Okay. I can't figure out how to get to the tabs because the top of the thing is blocking the tabs. If I go like this, do you see my entire desktop now, or?
No, we just see,
Lovely.
Oh, there it is.
Cool beans. Okay. So I'm a fairly visual thinker and learner. And so this is just an example of how I mapped out our farm. This is not to scale in any which way, but it includes all of our beds. And I usually print this document out. I made this on Google Draw, so very accessible for anyone. And I usually print it out and I start to write in with pencil what crops I might want to see in certain areas. So this is one method I use to just get things started in the winter. And obviously after doing this for a number of years, I know, if I'm looking at the purple zone right over here, I know what I planted there last year, but I usually have the diagram from each year ready to go on my table as part of one of the many puzzle pieces that exist. But less colorful and also perhaps even more useful is our master crop plan crop rotation guide. So now we're getting into my spreadsheets, and I know from looking at other people's spreadsheets in the past that could be pretty daunting. And so I know there's going to be time for questions and feel free to ask, but I'm going to focus here on 2021. You know what? Let me go to the rotation guide first. So how do we decide what's going to go into each bed other than thinking about the families? I created the rotations that we use for our sunny beds and our shade beds. So you guys were all thinking earlier about the type of sunlight you get, or if you have a wall next to your planting area, and whatever it is that you might struggle with. It's important to kind of categorize your beds in that way so that you know what can go in a specific zone. So here I have all of our sunny beds, and from that diagram before you saw, we organized by color. So we have the yellow zone, we have the brown zone. There are about 6 beds in all of our zones in the sunny area. There's a reason for that being all even. That way when we're rotating, if we have tomatoes in yellow one year and there's 6 beds of tomatoes, we're not going to have 9 beds a following year. So it's always the same number of seeds and seedlings that we need. That's just a form of organization and efficiency that's helpful on this scale. Certainly not something that needs to be thought about too much in regards to backyard gardening. But then when we get into the nitty gritty, this is the fun part, thinking about that crop rotation. And so this is in the order that we'd be rotating it in. So here's the yellow zone. If in one year the yellow zone is getting, we're planting the brassicas. And when I say late brassicas, that's really our fall crop of brassicas. So they'll be planted in the summer for the fall. We know that we can fit garlic in there beforehand. So we have that planted right now, and we'll be harvesting that later in the season, and then we'll be planting our brassicas right after. The following year, that zone will have grains, maybe some basil. I needed to throw it in somewhere, So you'll see sometimes there's arbitrary decisions being made. So I don't want to, make people think it's this, super exact science. I will throw some random things in there. And then we'll have some late greens that might overwinter. The following year, that bed or those beds will have tomatoes. And so now we're thinking of, a really large crop, deeply rooted tomatoes. Oh, and I say over here, they're heavy feeders. And there's a reason they're following the grains. The grains are going to act as a cover crop, which will add more nitrogen into the soil. So there's a thought process to all of this. And I hope this has been up on the screen long enough to at least get a somewhat of an idea of the reasons behind the order here. But you could see when there's arrows, that indicates that in that zone or in those beds, we can fit different crops back to back. So that's a form of succession planting. If you see something like, I want to use an example, where are we? Okay, so the legumes, we might even have multiple successions of legumes in the beds throughout the season. And so as we harvest, we notice that our beans aren't producing as well anymore. We can throw more beans into the soil until we're ready to put some greens in. So that's a form of succession cropping that we do. So how do we take it from this list of just a lot of words into that diagram? And
Ciara,
yeah.
Quick question. What does undersown mean?
Where do we have that? These heavy feeders follow grains, which will also act as cover crop and will be undersown with, cool. So this is actually something that I have not practiced, but it's nice that I put it there to try to do. The idea there is that when we have the tomatoes, they'll grow upwards along a trellis. And that means that we could plant a cover crop while they're still growing, probably towards the end of the season, not necessarily the whole season. But instead of, amending with more compost throughout the season or allowing our tomatoes to kind of just slowly wither and end their season, which they will no matter what in our climate. But we can also start to undersow. We can sow clover or peas throughout the growing season to get a kind of a jump start on the cover crop.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We used to do that. It totally works.
Cool.
For any crop that gets tall, where you can actually see the soil underneath. So it also works for kale and collards that get tall.
Yeah. And what's wonderful about that too is it suppresses weeds. So if you want to think about just covering your soil with something that's not going to pull the nutrients from the crops that you're trying to eat, but that's going to help them, then that's something you can do. Right, eggplant, pepper, all of that can work. What I do, mostly because we really want a crop of early vegetables. So we teach classes on the farm. And so we want to be able to provide food for students during the school year, which of course doesn't match up super well with the growing season. And so we think a lot about those cold hardy early season crops. And so I could actually use an example. I'm going to go to where we're planting our tomatoes this year. So it's in our orange zone. And I know that tomatoes are going to be really that summer crop. We know those are going to be the main crops in that bed, but we can fit something in there beforehand. Just like we were just talking about undersowing the clover towards the end, we can fit some sort of early green. So what I do is I print out this document, and you see there's space under.
Can we zoom in a little bit onto that section that you're looking at?
If I can figure that out, why not? Let's see. Yeah. Something like this.
That's awesome.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're looking right here. And so I usually print this out, and right underneath, so I'll have all of the beds outlined, right? We have the orange zone here, we have the purple, and I have the other diagram, and I just get to choose what I want to grow based on what other people want me to grow too. It's not only my decision, but I print it out, and right under early greens, I'll decide, and I'm going to just type it here for the sake of showing you all, but I'll decide that I'm going to put spinach in there. And maybe I don't only want spinach, maybe I also want there to be an early crop of arugula, so maybe half the beds will be arugula, half the beds will be spinach. Now, I've been doing this long enough to know, without looking at the other documents that Mara shared earlier, that we'll be able to get a spinach crop and an arugula crop prior to the tomatoes having to go into the ground, or we'll be harvesting them just as we're putting the tomatoes in. So we're clearing out space for the tomatoes to grow. while the spinach kind of continues for a little while, and then we stop it during the season. So that's one way of fitting a lot into one space, and that's how we practice it at the urban farm. And then at the end of the season, something I really like doing, tomatoes, as many of you probably know, they grow up a trellis. And what else grows on trellises? Sugar snap peas. And sugar snap peas are one of my favorite things to grow. And what's really amazing is just as the tomatoes are going out of season, we can plant our peas, and they'll grow up the same trellis. So we're not putting any more infrastructure in place, and sugar snap peas are legumes, so they're adding some nitrogen into the soil. So that's a really nice way of kind of rotating a single zone or a single bed between crops. Now, Mara was saying, and I think this is important for backyard growers to realize, is you don't have to fill an entire raised bed with just tomatoes or just the spinach before the tomatoes. You can grow them all together, and that's just a matter of spacing and understanding kind of where that sunlight is. And I can leave that for questions, but I wanted to show you the next step. So this is how much it requires. I'm telling you, it's a real 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. But we print this out, we write what we want and everything. And I should show you that this is 2021, but I already know what 2022 and 2023 and so on are going to look like because of that rotation guide on this page. So I just have it so that, you know, the following year, this zone is going to be a completely different set of crops based on that guide. Now, how do we know when we're going to plant everything and what the spacing is? And now we get a little bit headier with this crop plan. And I don't need to go super in depth unless there are specific questions, but I want to just point out the type of information that we include in here that can come from all of those documents that Mara and that I shared. And so, of course, we know our crops. Those are what you choose. And if you're growing in a space like mine, you want to indicate, where you're going to plant it. What's really important, though, is to determine, lots of numbers and words. What's really important is, I wonder if I should zoom in a little bit, is to determine that field planting date. So we want to know when the tomatoes are going to go into the ground, because if we don't know when the tomatoes are going to go into the ground, we don't know what can fit in there beforehand, and we don't know how long they could last. And how do we determine that? With all of those guides. Eventually it becomes intuitive. You wake up one morning and you just know that it's time to put them in the ground, but that doesn't happen for a while. And I certainly still look at all of those resources. What's really nice about spreadsheets is that the formulas kind of do the work for you once you have it set up. And so if I put in the field planting date here, that's going to tell me the field planting week. Right, let me that'll, something like that. Or I put in, what's that?
Can you zoom in just a little bit more, maybe just so we can see like those top 2 or 3 rows?
Okay, let's see what I can do. Whew. Something like that work?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm going to focus on collards here. That's a nice crop. So if I know the field planting date, and I know if I want to transplant or direct seed and indicate it here, there are formulas associated with those columns that will start to calculate different things. So if we're transplanting and I know the field planting date, I need to know when I have to start those seeds in a greenhouse. And that requires another number. It requires the, not dates to maturity. I'm pointing, but you guys are not here, so I got to get better at using the mouse. Apologies. Days in the greenhouse. So if collards are going to be in the greenhouse for 42 days, then this date is going to use that number right there, and the fact that there's a transplanting happening, subtract it from the field planting date, and give us the date for greenhouse sow. So I know, and this is coming up shortly, but I know early February I need to start my collards if I want them to go exactly where I decided. I'm pointing again. If I want them to go in the light blue zone at that time, and in the number of successions that I want. And so, interesting, I'm missing, oh, there it is. So I also have this category, which is important if we're thinking about succession planting. I only want one set of collards because they're the early brassicas. After that, I know based on my other guide that we're going to be putting garlic in. So there's not going to be time to put other colors. Let me just show you an example of one with more successions. Let's see, maybe, yeah, we could go with scallions. I like scallions. So with the scallions, we're thinking about seeding intervals. How many weeks between each seeding do you need in order to keep that bed full? And I've determined that scallions, we could seed them about every 9 weeks for 3 successions. A lot of people actually seed them even more. I just don't harvest so regularly, so that's not necessary. So this is also for backyard gardening. If you're not producing for market, you don't need to be rushing to get your seeds going at all times. You can think strategically about your space and about the manpower that you have. You don't necessarily need to follow all of the guidelines. So this is just an example of, we're going to have 3 successions. That's also a formula, just so you know. So it's based on the intervals. And we'll know that every 9 weeks, and I'll have a calendar on the farm, every 9 weeks we're going to make sure to put the scallions in. Similarly to the collards above, we have the greenhouse sow week, which is pulling from the field planting week. Now, those are all the dates. That's wonderful. But then when we get to the field, we still need more information, and this spreadsheet has that as well. So all of the spacing requirements we put in here too. Mara, I don't remember if you shared the square foot gardening concept. Did you?
Let me check. Yeah, it's under the crop planning.
Cool. Wonderful. So yeah. For those who aren't familiar with square foot gardening, it's really about maximizing your growing space, typically in a raised bed situation, so that you're growing within a 12 by 12 area. I do not practice square foot gardening, but a lot of the principles of my spacing are similar. In that, if a seed packet says that these scallions need 6 inches, between each scallion, I'm also going to say there only needs to be 6 inches between each row. I'm not going to put 12 inches between each row. I'm not going to give them more space. So I am thinking a little bit based on just the in-row spacing. So another example, just quickly. So eggplant down here, they need 18 inches. And so that's 18 inches between them in every direction. I don't think about giving them more. And that way I could fit, more rows per bed. The reason I need this in the crop calendar or in the crop plan is to then eventually calculate how many seeds we're going to need to purchase, to start, and all of that. So there's a lot of information. I just threw, way too much at you, but I hope you enjoyed. And I think it's time to open up for questions.
Yeah, so
I could stop sharing my screen.
Great. That was so cool. Thank you, Ciara. It's wild to see just like all of that information in one place, and it's handy, so handy that you set it up with all those formulas so that you don't have to do all those calculations every year.
Yes, and I should just very quickly, so the first time you set up a spreadsheet like that, it can take forever, but then in any other year, all you're doing is copy and pasting. So anytime in the future, you're good to go.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So will one of my colleagues please unmute and let's get started on questions. We'll be pulling them from the chat, so if you have any questions, just go ahead and add them there.
I can read the questions.
We could do it. Thank you, Debbie.
Yep. So, okay, the first one was from Vanessa. I struggle with adjusting the starting planting times to work with frost protection, like floating row cover, wall of waters, etc. Just much earlier. Can I start if I'm using, maybe how much earlier can I start if I'm using those season extension tools?
That's a really good question. So you're saying that, I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. You want to be able to start earlier, and you're wondering how much earlier that is if you're using something like a tunnel, plastic, or a row cover. That's accurate?
Yes, got a thumbs up.
Wonderful. So I usually, there's a lot of experimenting to do with that. I think if you're thinking about your cold hardy crops, like spinach, like some of those leafy greens, especially the kale, collard, spinach variety, lettuce is a little bit, sometimes a little, more finicky. You can start them under that really whenever you'd be starting them in a greenhouse, starting the seeds for transplant. So if they take 40 or 30 days in a greenhouse, you can potentially start them 30 days earlier outside under cover. That would be an experiment. Of course, if we end up with a crazy winter or a moment that a late frost, then who knows. But that's usually how I play that.
Okay, and then the next question is, would you share your spreadsheet? I think that question came up more than once.
Yeah, I'm seeing some wonderful questions and comments about it. It's funny, someone said that that's not as complicated. It's more complicated than theirs. I didn't even get a chance to share you a more complicated one that I inherited 2 years ago that blew my mind. And then this winter, I like rehashed it into what I just showed you. And yes, I can create a template version of that, and I guess share with GreenThumb, share with Nara. Sweet.
Yeah, I guess since everybody's from different states here, they're probably going to vary in which kind of plants you're going to grow. And then the next one is field planting week. The number, I think this is in reference to your spreadsheet, yep. Is field planting week the number of weeks after the last frost?
Exactly. So that is calculated. I didn't show you this column in the spreadsheet because we were already overwhelmed, but I actually have a whole column that says when the first frost and last frost is, and it can be calculated backwards based on, the number of weeks needed. I also should say, we're thinking a lot about categories, and I think about planting time in a week instead of a specific day. It just works better that way. There's a chunk of time that you can plant your tomatoes. It doesn't have to be on a specific date.
And then I think you maybe answered this question, but from Amiel, do you adjust the sow dates if we get a late frost?
Yeah, so another part of the spreadsheet that I did not show you was the actuals tab. And so as the season goes on, really all a crop plan is a plan, and it never goes as planned. So I'll be monitoring the weather, we'll be monitoring our own soil, and then we will go from there. And then we'll write, the actual date that we end up planting or we end up sowing, so that next year we can base it on all of that.
And then from Georgia, so with 3 successions, is each succession of scallion seeds going to a distinct space or overlapped with those? Oh, that was already answered. Okay, sorry. So the next one, what are your favorite companion planting combos?
Ooh. Well, there's different types of companion planting that I'll do. We throw a lot of flowers in there for pollinator purposes, and flowers will just do so wonderfully in most of our fruiting crop beds. So something like marigolds or nasturtium in with our solanum crops, so the tomatoes, eggplants, peppers. In terms of the vegetable crops that we grow together, so more intercropping, we will keep the spinach in with the tomatoes for a while. Same the peas and the tomatoes. I'm trying to think of what else we're growing. Let me see my my list. We'll do beets and chard are in the same family, and sometimes we'll have them growing together, and also thinking those aren't using the same parts of the soil, right? So the beets are the roots, and then the chard we're eating the leaves. And then others aren't popping into my head at the moment.
Great, so I'll jump in for Babby. So the next question is, how do you account for margins of error in maturity time? Like if dry conditions or excessive heat have slowed or hurt growth? how do you account for the impact on your crop plan and adjust it as you're planning the season?
Yeah, I try to look at the crop plan pretty regularly at the start of each week and kind of adjust the spreadsheet. And that's mostly for record purposes and less for, on the ground during the season. And so if, for instance, the spinach isn't, I'm going to keep using this one example because that's what's on the top, at the top of mind right now. But if the spinach is not ready to harvest and we need to put our tomatoes in because the tomatoes are overgrowing their greenhouse, I'm not necessarily going, so what I'll mark on the spreadsheet for the following year is our spinach needs to go in earlier if we're going to do that, those two together. But I'm not going to pull all the spinach out. What I'll do is just remove the spinach where the tomatoes need to go themselves. So if the tomatoes are being planted every 24 inches, I'll remove the spinach from every 24 inches of the bed and I'll let the rest, stay in until it's ready to harvest. So that's one way of kind of adapting. I also do not necessarily, the plan is not a religious plan. I'm not going to, if I have too many scallions and the succession isn't ready to harvest and I already have the next one ready to go, I might find a different spot on the farm to put those in. And that might be where you see most of our companion planting happening. It's almost in the mistakes or in the margins of errors where we start throwing things together that we know will work, but we don't necessarily plan for.
Great. So our next question is about cucumber beetles. Anne had a question: how can I save my crop if the beetles are already there? And will changing the location next year help prevent the beetles?
So 100% changing the location is important. That's for any pest or disease. We saw so many cucumber beetles last year. It was really worrisome at the start. One way to prevent that is to actually plant out your cucumbers later. So later in the season. So if you usually plant them, whenever you plant them, push it by 2 or 3 weeks. They're going to do just fine. Cucumbers actually have a shorter growing season, even though they love, the heat of the summer. But if you push them, they're going to do fine, and that might hold off the pest issues. I've heard, good things. I've heard that it works. I've heard that it doesn't, but that's your best shot. Also, plant nasturtium. Cucumber beetles love nasturtium.
Ooh, that's exciting. I also love nasturtium, so we have something in common. So our next question is, do you take volunteers at your site?
That's a wonderful question. Yes, we do. We take individual volunteers during the growing season on Saturdays and Sundays, and you can find out more about that on our website, which is randallsisland.org. And yeah, open to volunteers starting probably in April.
Definitely something to look forward to. So our next question is about row cover. So Vanessa says, row cover often says provide 4 degrees of protection, but how many days earlier can I start? It seems like a crapshoot, but there has to be some kind of rule of thumb about that.
Yeah, I think, I don't know offhand. I think my suggestion earlier still stands, is that not necessarily with row cover, but with plastic over hoops, I'd pretend that's a little greenhouse and go ahead and put those cold hardy veggies in there. Yeah, otherwise I would want to do research before saying anything. I think rules of thumb, you never know. You got to try it in your area and see what happens.
And I think there's another follow-up question is, where can we get cover crop seeds?
This is from Lenny. Hi, Lenny. Yes, cover crop seeds. You could get them from any, most seed companies. We order from all over the place. Johnny Seeds is, a very popular one, but if you're looking for, to support some smaller businesses, there are a lot of them. I don't know who has, large bulk items of cover crop seeds offhand, but you should Google seed companies in the area and just start looking, and they have them.
Great. Ooh, our next question is about tomatoes. So Anne says that she grows tomatoes in a half barrel. What would be a good crop to rotate into the barrel to restore the soil nutrients? She also is adding some compost and manure.
Yeah, I mean, compost is wonderful. Oh, I see someone mentioned Fedco. That's a great seed company. Hudson Valley Seed Company is great. I'll start listing way too many if I start. But with this question, so does that mean that the tomatoes are going in the same spot every year? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, it sounds like maybe they're trying to, because it's in like a half barrel. So
Cool.
I think maybe they're looking to do a little rotation.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what I was saying could really work in that type of space. So throwing in either bush beans or snap peas, but then also compost is wonderful. And I often think, you know, truth be told, I don't do a lot of cover cropping in my raised beds. I find it takes a lot of time and doesn't get turned into the soil as easily as it would in spaces that are larger, where you can kind of dig a little bit deeper at the start of a growing season. And so I rely heavily on compost, which is fantastic. And that'll certainly give your tomatoes nutrients to grow, you know, a while. I think that the big issue with tomatoes is the disease that they can harbor year after year. And so that's something to look out for. And unfortunately, compost will not necessarily help with that.
Great. So our next question is, how do you get cilantro to multiply?
How do you get cilantro to multiply? Do you mean like cut and come back again?
That was coming from Joe.
Joe, if you're still here, let's see. Well, I could speak about any herbs, and if I'm understanding the question correctly, to get cilantro to kind of get bigger and bushier and just kind of keep harvesting it for a while, similar to a lot of herbs, you want to cut it down to where you see new buds, new growth towards the bottom, not all the way to the bottom, maybe an inch or two above the soil. But if you do that, it'll continue to grow.
Great. So if you're still here, Joe.
Quick time check that we have 1 minute left.
Okay, so I'll pull, maybe there are two questions here. I think one that's really great is from Vanessa. It's how much seed saving do you do?
Really lovely question. We are always looking to do more. That isn't the focus of the farm. And because we're growing over 200 varieties of crops, we'll have a lot of mix and matching in our seed genetics if we try to save seed without thinking it through thoroughly prior to doing that. But certainly some.
Great. And then I'll say maybe this will be our last question, which I think is an important one, is what is the period of time that you allow the soil to rest before moving on to other different crops?
That's a really wonderful question. Typically not so much time, to be honest, in the growing season. When we see a bed that's empty, we try to put plants in. That said, because of the crop rotation and the way that we're, you know, adding nutrients to the soil and focusing on different parts of the soil, you know, if our deep-rooted crops are going in one year, they're taking nutrients out from a certain area of the soil, and then our shallow root crops might follow, and they're taking, you know, the nutrients from a different area of the soil. That's more of our focus. It is really wonderful to let your soil sit. You don't want to let your soil sit uncovered. It's really good to cover it either with a layer of compost or a layer of mulch.
Great. So as it is 1 o'clock, I know we have a few more questions here, but out of respect for time, I think we can end the Q&A there.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you so much, Ciara. That was incredible. And Simone, Babby, Elena, thank you so much for your Q&A support. We'll be sharing the recording in a few days or next week. And thank you so much, Ciara, for offering a template. That's going to be amazing. I think folks are really going to enjoy that. Thank you again, everyone. for tuning in today. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day, and good luck with all your crop planning.
Good luck, everyone. Nice to